Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's educational webinar on SQL Client Tables, a.k.a. Pivot Tables on Steroids. My name is Stacy Jensen. I'm the Sales Manager for the Business Intelligence and Document Management Divisions here at Help Systems, and I will be your host for today's webinar.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Spieler. I'm a training and services consultant at Help Systems, and I've been working with IBM information delivery since 1988 and with Sequel and Viewpoint since 2002, and I'm happy to be presenting this topic today.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm not seeing our slides advance.
Well, then let's bounce back to the slide thing. I thought I had pushed this button. So there's the title slide that they missed. I do apologize.
Nope, we saw that.
And then there's Stacy, who you just had a chance to hear, and me, who you had a chance to hear, and now you got to see our faces. Don't know if that's good or bad. Let me pass it back to you, Stacy.
Great, thanks, Steve. So a little housekeeping about today's session. If you have questions during the session, use the questions feature to send those in. We'll do our best to address those questions at the end of the webinar. I'm also recording the webinar and we'll include a link to the recording in our follow-up email. So we have a great session plan, but before we get started, I wanted to touch on the services that are available to our SQL community. Our training classes really allow you to get the most out of SQL. Technical background is not required. We have scheduled classes, on-demand training available. We can even customize classes to meet your unique needs. Maybe you don't need training, but you could use a good mentor, and Steve is a great mentor. These one-on-one or small group sessions are conducted on your system with your data. The result really is usable information and the strengthening of your SQL skills. Consulting is available. We can help plan, assess, develop, and implement your data access and BI projects. Another area we can help with is product installation and upgrades. And then last, we work with many companies who have multiple tools, and they were looking for ways to consolidate that work within SQL, and they have utilized our migration services for that. So just one last item that we have available in our services department. So I think we're set with that. Steve, we can move on and get started with the education.
Thanks, Stacy, and I appreciate the compliment about my mentoring skills. Hi, everybody. Steve again. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to begin with making sure you understand what we mean by a client table, because though powerful, not all SQL and Viewpoint customers are using it right now. Now, client tables begin with a view. So its foundation is something that you're already familiar with through your existing work with SQL and Viewpoint. Once you've got your view, the creation of the actual client table is easy because we offer a really nice wizard to facilitate that. Now, the biggest part of client tables is what the end user can do with them. So we'll be spending some time focusing on the end user experience. We're also going to talk a little bit about some things we can do beyond creation of a simple client table and the end user experience, some additional enhancements you can do to your client table. We're going to talk about deployment because the deployment could be done a few different ways. And we'll have a wrap up and an opportunity for questions and answers. And you can pose those questions during the session, but we will address them at the end. Now, when you're talking about client tables, you're talking about different SQL products. Viewpoint is one of those products. We use Sequel Viewpoint for creation of the client tables, as well as a delivery mechanism within Windows. Another way of delivering client tables are in the browser environment, and that uses the SQL Web Interface software, and that requires the SWS, the SQL Web Server, to do deployment of client tables. Another component which is included, the client table viewer. This is used when you have, instead of real-time data needs, what we would call distributed deployment. And this allows a lot of flexibility in a Windows environment. And you'll see more about that a little later on. So, what is a client table? It's referred to frequently as an OLAP, an industry term, online analytical processing. What does that really mean? It means flexible analytics for your end user. That's what you would get as a result for a well-designed OLAP, and client tables makes that pretty easy. Client tables provide dynamic data manipulation, easy for the end user to control. This includes things like data pivoting, drill to detail, dynamic filtering by the user, and summary restatement. That's just a few of the things. You'll see more during the demonstration of the end user process. Also, you can create output as data or as charts. And these data and charts can be saved to PC files as well. Now, not shown here is that all of this is included with your sequel. Okay, we're not talking about an add-in here. This is something you already have, but maybe haven't started using yet. All right, I think this really says it all. Like most things in SQL, client tables begin with a view. Now, the benefit is the view being the foundation of data in SQL and being the foundation of your client tables, the view building skills that you or your team have are going to serve you really well when you're working on creating client tables. So what does the view create and contribute to your client table? First and foremost, it's the source of the client table data, but it's really so much more than that. In the view, you set what's going to be the analysis points and summary levels of the information for the end user. This comes from the select clause of your view. The data elements, the things that you want to analyze, that is also coming from your view select clause. Your view can be set up to provide filtering so that the data that goes to the client table is filtered based on the criteria that you set. That can be static criteria, or with runtime prompting, the end user, when running the client table, will get the same kind of prompt that they get when running a view, so that they can choose the year, the period, their date range at runtime of what they're going to look at and analyze. Also within the view, you control the descriptions that are used for all of the analysis points and data elements. So all of this stuff comes from your view. Now, the view that I'm going to use for my demonstration pulls information from these 4 tables. It's kind of funny because in my notes I have 3, but there's 4. The sales fact table, the periods table, the products table, and the stores table. Now, I've kind of coded it in different ways to kind of identify the things that we've got here. In bold and gray, we have amount SLS and unit SLS. These are fields that are the data elements. These are the things we're going to analyze in the client table. Now, the non-bolded gray fields, these are fields that are analysis points. These are used for dynamic filtering, for how we analyze and how we summarize the data as we manipulate the client table. These all come from the select clause of the underlying view. Now, the ones in blue I've added not because they're in the view, but they could have been. So in other words, the ones in gray I chose when I designed the view as the analysis points that I wanted, but I wasn't limited to these. So if I didn't want to analyze products just by line, family, and category, I could have included the SKU or the publisher of the product. So there's other elements I could have added, and those would all become analysis points for my client table and filter opportunities. All right, so once you have the view created with the elements that you need for analysis, now you're ready to create your client table with a wizard that's really easy. So how easy is it? Well, I'm going to review the wizard in the next few slides, but you're going to see, because I'll also be building one from scratch as part of the demonstration that's coming up before too long. But let's talk about those wizard steps now. So here on the left, we have wizard step number 1. I know that's pretty obvious. Here we have just really two things to do. We can put in a title for the client table. This is the description we'll see in the Viewpoint Explorer, and it is also, again, the title or the heading for the client table. Additionally, we can see the fields. These are the fields from the underlying views select clause that are available for row summarization, column summarization, filtering, pivoting, etc. But all we can do at this particular stage is choose a title. Wizard step 2 on the right, we go a little deeper. Now we're basically choosing the field or fields that we'd like to have for row summarization as a starting point. This is just a starting summary level, and the end user can choose from all the available analysis fields to override that or augment that. So the user is not held hostage by the choice here. It's just a starting point that you think is appropriate. On wizard step 3, on the left here, here's where I identify the field or fields that will make up the initial column summary level for the client table. And again, just like in the row summarization, this also can be changed by the end user. Last but not least, wizard step 4 on the right. Now this is a little bit different. This is where you choose the field or fields that will be the data elements of your client table. Here, the end user uses what you choose. So if you choose the sales dollars field, that's what they'd see. If they chose the units or the quantity field, that's what they'd see. If you chose them both, that's what they'd see. Okay, but that's not changeable by the user. Okay, so we're actually ready for the first demonstration. So during the creation demonstration, I'm going to introduce you to the view that's going to be the source of data for the client table. I'm going to run through all of the 4 wizard steps. I'm also going to show you that after you get through the wizard, you could then maybe change your mind and adjust the row and column summarization. Then I'll save the client table, but you will have to wait a little longer to see us manipulate it. So today, or this demo right now, is just for creation. Okay, so here we're looking at my recent tab in Viewpoint, and I'm going to double click to run the view that I'm going to be utilizing for this client table. It's named CT View. Now this particular view returns, if I were to retrieve all the records, a little over 14,000 records. And that'll come into play as we go ahead and work when we actually run our client table. But here we can see the data that we've got. So we've got time type data, product type data, dollars and units, and geographic type data. And that's what's going to be driving the client table. So I'm going to launch the wizard now. Right click, new client table. And this is going to start the process and launch wizard step 1. Now, I tend to use somewhat generic descriptions or titles for my table because what the user sees, excuse me, is based on the user's choice. And here we can see the available fields, and I'm going to click next to move on to wizard step number 2. So I'm going to begin with my rows being product related, and I think I'll choose product line. So I'll have 1 row for every unique product line as my starting point. I click next, and all I did was double click to add that. I'm now choosing the field or fields for my columns. Here I'm going to choose the region field. So product related rows and geographic related columns. Next again. Now the data fields. Remember, whatever I choose is what the user gets. I'm going to choose unit sales as opposed to amount sales, which is dollars. I could have chosen both, but I choose not to. So I'm going to click finish. Okay, so here is the client table, or at least the client table tab of the design environment. If I pop over here to the Files and Fields tab, I can actually see the view that was created to drive this client table. And again, additional columns could be added. The other thing I want to kind of show you is that if I change my mind at this point and think maybe I need a little more than just one row per product line, I can go ahead and override what I chose in the wizard. So I'm going to choose the product family field, left click on it, and I'm going to drag it and put it right next to product line. You'll notice a little green bar when I'm in the right spot. And that's the same process the end user is going to use to alter the summary levels. So here we have the data. Now remember, this is just some of the data because in the design screen, it only loads 75 records. We don't want to load all 14,000 records just to do creation. So I'm going to take a moment to save this. Into a library on the IBM. And I'm going to call it SALEANAL, sales analysis. I'll be running that client table a little later on. And that was the creation demo. Quite simple.
So, Steve, before we move on to the end user experience, I have a quick polling question for our guests today. I'm hoping everybody will participate. And the question is, how can help systems help you with your SQL training needs? And we really have 5 options there, so you can pick all that apply. We have new team members, and they could use SQL training. We hear that quite often. We know the basics, but could use training on advanced topics. We need more training on administration, setup, and security. We could benefit from some personalized mentoring, and we do not currently have any training needs. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to answer our poll. We really appreciate that. And then, Steve, I think we can go ahead and move on with our training. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, and that gave me a chance to take a sip of water, which is always good too. So we've done the poll. We're now ready to kind of focus on the end user experience. And I think that's the most important part, what a user can do with this. So again, that's the core benefit. Let's talk about this image. Flexible. Now I meant this to be like data manipulation flexible, but the image that my marketing people chose I kind of like because another aspect of the flexibility is where you can do your flexible analysis and manipulation. And it could be done sitting in a beautiful mountain scene like this. But again, flexibility is the key. So the end user experience. The end user experience focuses on things like dynamically changing the summary level. This can be done by placing fields, by just dragging fields that are available into rows and columns, or collapsing trees to change the summary level at any time. Data pivoting allows you to take an analysis field that's maybe currently represented as a column and make it row summarization instead, and versa versa. Filtering can be done on analysis fields, one or many. Now you can filter on an analysis field that makes up your rows or your columns or is just available to be used, and you might just choose to use it only for filtering. Now charting cells is just like creating a chart in a view in Viewpoint. Highlight the cells, click the graph icon, choose your graph type, and you've got it. Drill to detail. From any level that you can create within the client table, you can double click on the cell representing a value, and it's going to drill down and show you all the detail. This is the greatest level of detail coming from that underlying view to see what makes up that cell. And here we can see client table detail at the bottom of the screen. Last but not least, PC file output. From your client table, you can take the table in its current configuration. So you've sliced and diced and restated and filtered, and I want to create a spreadsheet or an HTML, I can do it. Or maybe if I've drilled down on a particular cell, I want that detail to be exported to Excel so I can send it to somebody who's not looking at my client table, but I want them to be aware. The charts can also be saved as PC files for distribution as well. So that's what we mean by our end user experience and the kind of things you can do. So why is the end user experience so dynamic? It's helpful to look at these portions of the client table experience. So when you run a client table, the underlying view is going to retrieve the detailed data that it delivers. And that data becomes the detail for, or that's available for your client table. Now, that detail is actually going to be saved in a temporary DBase file. And that file resides on the end user's PC, assuming they're running in Windows. On the other hand, if they're running the client table from the browser, that file is going to reside in the SQL Web Interface's SWS server. Regardless, that's what gives it all that flexibility to then do the analysis, which is really why you're there in the first place. So because of that table, we can do our pivoting, our drilling, our changing of summary levels, our dynamic filtering, etc. So all that comes from that process. So guess what? Another demonstration. I bet you've been anxious to see what that client table that I created and saved can do for us. So I'm going to show you what we can accomplish. All right, so let me bring back up Viewpoint. And here's that client table on my recent tab, and I'm double clicking to run it. Now remember, this is going to have a little more time involved. Why? Because this is right now downloading 14,000 records to my PC and placing them in that temporary DBase file that I told you about. So this might take 20 or 25 seconds, depending on your connection speed, etc. And again, the more records, the more time. But this is going to give us this unparalleled flexibility, and it's now retrieved the data. So how do we manipulate it? Let's do some manipulation. So it's displayed. Look at the bottom. It says client table data loaded 14,251 records. That's telling us the number of records that were in the temporary DBase file. Remember, I could have been prompted at runtime to choose what data I want. I'm just getting all of it right now. So I'm going to begin by filtering. If I look at the year dropdown, and I'm clicking the dropdown next to the available analysis field year, I can see data comes from 2001 or 2002. Now, you can basically click on the X's to get what you want. Just know that these icons here, asterisk means flip-flop, chosen is unchosen, and vice versa. Minus sign removes all the X's, allowing me to then pick individuals. I'm going to choose 2001 with a left click. The check mark here will accept it. The X will just say don't make any changes. So I'm going to use the check mark and accept it. And the numbers got a little bit smaller. There were only a few months in 2002, so it wasn't a drastic reduction. Now I want to do some other filtering. Right now, our regions, Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe are shown, and maybe I'm not responsible for Asia Pacific. So I'm going to remove that check or that X, and I'm going to use the check to accept it. And now I'm looking at just those. So we're filtering on a column element. We're filtering on an unused element as far as rows and columns. Now maybe I'm thinking 2 columns of data is not really enough. So I'm going to drag country from what I call the bench and put it right next to the region field. Now this is going to organize the countries by region. Now maybe I don't want it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and drag region and put it back up on the bench. So now I've got a list of my countries in North and South America and Europe. But we don't have Japan and we don't have Australia because they're part of the Asia Pacific, and I've filtered that out. Now, maybe I want to see what makes up certain things. So I'm intrigued by the business and investing value that I see for Ireland. So I'm going to double click on that record, that cell, if you will, and now we have the detail that makes that up, the periods, the year, the information. And if we'd gone down to the SKU level, we'd have that as well. Remember, this can be exported to Excel for portability. Okay, now I'm going to kind of do some pivoting. And by the way, remember, we can expand and contract at any time, but pivoting I think is neater. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the month and put it next to country, because I'd like periods for my columns, but not periods by country. So I'm going to move country and I'm going to put it here next to product line, and I'm going to get rid of product family because that's really not in a good spot. But as you can see, we now have an entirely different way of presenting the data. And this might be suitable for me to do a chart, maybe a line graph to show sales trending. In fact, that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to go ahead and choose some cells, and I'm going to grab 12 periods of a number of the countries for their books. And if I wanted to look at all country activity, regardless of product line, I would just drag product line and put it back on the bench. Click the chart button. Now the chart's not going to default to the line graph that I envisioned, but simple enough to change it. And it's the same controls that you would see in Viewpoint. And there we have our presentation showing sales trending by country for books. Quite easy for the end user to accomplish. Now let's say I want to export this to Excel. Pretty simple. Remember, I don't have to use Excel. Some people like HTML exports. Why? Because most people can't change an HTML, but they might be able to change a spreadsheet. But I'm going to export to Excel, and this is going to be my current way of seeing it. I'm going to put it on my desktop. And just to save time, I've actually got my Windows Explorer open, and there's that sales and Al just created a moment ago. And I'll just double click it to open up the spreadsheet. Unfortunately, it frequently opens up after a second click. I've got some weird little bug in my Excel, but there's the data. And now I can distribute that to somebody who doesn't have access to the system or client tables. Thus endeth the end user experience. So now we're going to talk about further enhancement and deployment. What else can we do with our client tables? There's a lot of things, but most people focus on the manipulation that you've just seen. So in the designer, not when you've run it, but in the designer, you have this format pull down menu. And in the format pull down menu, you have some choices. So the customization options are there. They're layout, data markers, calculated fields, and group footer. And I'm going to describe what those are so that you have some idea. So on this screen, we got on the left, the options under layout. So under layout, you have a series of tabs, each doing something different. Now the fields tab right over here, this is where we can control the sorting. It defaults to ascending, but you can override that for your analysis fields when they're used in rows and columns. You can also control the text that's used at totals. And if the field is a data field, you can in there control numeric editing and the summary operator that would be used for that field. It defaults to some, but you're not limited to that. Now in the Preferences tab, you can control the row and column alignment and add user restrictions. Now, for instance, you can disable dynamic filtering within the table if you wish. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you can. The Printer tab is, of course, for printer output, printing to your PC printer, where you have things to control your margins, your heading alignment, page break controls. The Fonts tab is your opportunity to change the font and font size. And the font and font size has different areas of the client table that can be controlled differently, so it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can choose different areas to have different fonts and different sizes based on your audience's preferences. And then the color tab. Here you can control the color for many different items. Um, and you can also control background colors and button colors. Now on the right, we've got an example of the screen for data markers. So a data marker is how you can color code results based on your own performance metrics. Now I usually stick with red, yellow, and green, or just red and green sometimes, but you can be more comprehensive. You're not limited to just a few colors. There can be as many as you feel necessary. Now you have the ability to create calculated fields within the client table using the calculated fields editor. In this particular example, I'm creating a sales dollars divided by sales units derived field. And on the right where it says define summary values, this is what you get when you choose the group footer option from the layout, or from the format, excuse me. Here you can control subtotal values. Now they tend to default to sum, just like the data. But if you're changing the data to be something like an average, you might want to do an average for your totals. So this gives you that choice to control them if you need. So you don't have to deal with sum, which is the default operator. Okay, another aspect of this was deployment. And as we've said a couple of times, client tables can be delivered in both the browser or in Windows. Both environments are great. They do have some different aesthetics, if you will. On the left, you see the client table deployed in the browser. On the right, you see the client table deployed in Windows. Again, some differences in how they look. On the left is the browser chart. On the right is the Windows chart with Viewpoint. And one more time, we've got the drill down to detail. The top one is your browser. The lower one is your Windows. Both can export to XLSX or XLS, excuse me, for easy distribution. All right. Now, early on, I mentioned something called the client table viewer, and I mentioned it was for distributed information delivery. Now, this means that I don't have to be logged onto my IBM or connected to it to get the benefits of analysis. It has the same flexibility as your client tables, the same drill to detail, the same pivoting, the same dynamic restatement of the summary levels and filtering. Everything is there. No connection to the IBM I, requires a Windows PC. You can export to Excel, the drill down to detail, and the actual client table after you've reformatted it for distribution. What it doesn't have is it doesn't have the charting component. So if you wanted a chart, you would export to Excel and you'd have to chart it there. But everything else works exactly the same. Now, knowing that it's there is one thing, but knowing how other customers use it might be important to you. So I'm going to just mention a couple of customer circumstances. We have one longtime Sequel customer who needed to get data out to their traveling sales reps, so over 40 of them, something they do nightly. And what they did is they created a job on the IBM and they pushed out client table files that could be run using that client table viewer to these sales reps on a nightly basis. Each sales rep getting only their customers' activity, detailed transaction level activity for all their customers, current year, prior year, year before that. Another one of our customers needed to give some information to their engineers. Now, they didn't have to push it all over the world, but they basically ran a job that puts the client table file out on a network folder. And then they just use the client table viewer to open it up, slice and dice, create the spreadsheets they need, and they were happy. So those are a couple scenarios where a customer has used client tables in a push out as opposed to live interactive data. So in summary, you've had a chance to learn about what client tables are and the capabilities it can provide you. We spent some time talking about how it begins with a view, and the view is where you can control the type of analysis and what will be analyzed and how it will be pulled in. You saw how easy it was to create because the wizard was 4 steps and quite easy for anybody to do. The demonstration focused on end user flexibility, and that's what you're giving your end users when you give them client tables. We talked a little bit about some of the less commonly used but nifty enhancements to a basic client table. And we talked about deployment options, browser, Windows, and distributed.
Lots of great information, Steve. Thanks so much. We do have a couple of questions. If you do have any questions at this time, feel free to go ahead and submit those through the question feature. We're going to try to get to these. So, Steve, the first question is, how do I get the client table viewer?
Okay, well, the client table viewer is available from the Help Systems community portal. So you have to be a licensed Help Systems customer with Sequel to be able to sign on and get it, but there's no cost. And once you've got it, you're free to distribute it to as many people in your organization as you want. Some people will distribute it to the users. Sometimes they'll actually place that client table viewer software in the same folder on the network that they put their client table files in, so they don't even have to distribute it to everybody.
Great. So you sort of touched on cost. Somebody did ask, how much does this solution cost? And I'll answer that. If you already own a Sequel license, you have the ability to use the client table option. So there's no charge if you are already a Sequel customer. If you're not, we certainly can have a sales rep get you some information on Sequel. So Steve, we've got a couple questions surrounding the
Yeah,
Excel.
let me see if I can answer a couple of them. One person is asking about the formatting of the charts. Because it uses the same charting software as we have in Viewpoint, instead of me going to choose charts, there is a chart menu that you can bring up that takes you into the underlying charting software. So if you need to have a bubble graph or some other more sophisticated chart, or you need to interact with it more deeply, you can do it there. On the other end, you might prefer to export it to Excel if you're more skilled at doing charts in Excel. So that's really up to you, but you do have the ability to control the charts more than what you saw during the demonstration. Now, another person is asking about, is the export to XLSX available? The software only allows you to export to XLS, not XLSX. So if you need it in that format, you'd have to then, once it's been saved, open it up and save it as an XLSX. Can you get a listing of all the files and fields available for use? Oh, I'm not sure if I understand that question from Melissa. The client table, the person designing the client table can always pop over to the Files and Fields tab or the SQL tab and see exactly what fields are available. I was over there very briefly during the demonstration. So if I've got a client table, I can see what else was there if I'm a designer. The end user can't. And we really don't want them to, because those files have lots of things in them that they really aren't going to understand and shouldn't even know is available as a choice. That's one of the reasons why you create it and then deploy it, because you're still controlling what they can get at.
Steve, how about this one? You mentioned needing something called SQL Web Server, Swiss server to deploy in a browser. What is that?
Well, the SQL web interface is a software that we offer. It's licensed separately from Sequel and Viewpoint. Many of our customers have it, but it can be deployed two different ways. One where it runs completely on the IBM, the other where it utilizes what we call the SWS, the SQL Web Server. Now that's included. You don't need to pay more for that, but there will be a server class PC as part of your browser configuration, and that's where the client table DBase file is created temporarily. And one person asked if that would sometime go away in the future. I really don't know, but right now that is the way it would be done. And it doesn't require a really heavy duty PC for that, a heavy duty PC for your server PC, but you do need that configuration. It utilizes the, Swiss uses the Tomcat server, whereas SQL Web Interface without it uses the Apache server on the IBM.
Okay, good. I know we're getting right to the end of our time here. There's a couple more questions. I think that what we'll do is we will definitely reach out and get you answers to your specific questions. So if we didn't address your question today, we will definitely have somebody reach out. And I just want to say thanks, Steve, for all the great information. Our hope is that you learned enough about client tables to identify areas where they can deliver needed analysis within your own organization. If you have services needs or questions, feel free to, you can explore the website. You can even submit a request through the website to be contacted, or feel free to reach out to your sales rep or myself. We're happy to talk through the options that are available to you. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to this recording, so you'll be able to go back and get your training all over again if you'd like to, or to share it with others within the organization. So that brings us to the end of our session. Steve, thanks again. Nice job with the education. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us.